Well, thanks very much, Barnaby. Thanks for the invitation to be here. Let me just see if I can share my. Let me see if I can share my screen. Um, um,
Bingo.
so I'll just be talking about our work on ash today. Oh, wait a minute. That's the wrong presentation. Sorry. Are you seeing Trees of Life? Do they exist?
Bingo.
We are, yes.
Okay. Sorry, wrong one. If you want that one, that's on YouTube. So if you want to know if Trees of Life exist, just Google that. Where's it gone? Does this I need to view.
That's fine.
How's that? Have you now got a full screen of
Yep.
a slide that says presentation on ash for Northwest Tree Health Partnership? Is that coming through?
Yes, we have. Yes, thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, sorry about that. You might want to edit the recording. Okay, thanks for the invitation. As Barnaby said, we work on oak. We also work on birch as well in the lab, but our main system is ash, and I'll be talking about ash today. But just to sort of step back a little bit as we begin, we all hear a lot in the news about we're in a biodiversity crisis. We're also in a climate crisis. And we've recently had big COP meetings about both of them. But I think all of us on the call here today would probably agree that we're also in a plant health crisis. And the plant health crisis interacts with the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. For example, the climate crisis affects the plant health crisis in terms of climate change affecting the range of different pests and pathogens. Here's just an example in the corn earworm, whose overwintering zone has changed over recent decades. But also the plant health crisis itself can affect the climate crisis. So, for example, the mountain pine beetle outbreak in Canada is estimated to have released 263 megatons of carbon into the atmosphere, which is comparable to 5.8 years of emissions from Canada's transport section. So there must be knock-on effects from the plant health crisis to the climate crisis. And of course, there's also interaction between the biodiversity crisis and the plant.
Oh no.
Problems in plant health because of the movement of pests and pathogens around the world in containers. And arguably, this is a much bigger driver of the plant health crisis than climate changes. This is having impacts at a much faster rate than climate changes, because we're moving pests and pathogens around the world like never before. And here's just a few examples of plant pests and pathogens moved around the world, introduced to naive areas by human beings, most of the time, of course, accidentally. And what we're doing with global trade is basically putting the world's biota into a blender and stirring everything up together. Microorganisms that used to be restricted to one continent are now present on other continents and vice versa. And they're meeting plant hosts which are completely naive to them and unable to resist them. And so whereas before they were in a nice ecological balance and able to coexist, these introductions mean that coexistence isn't happening and plants are dying. And so two examples that we'll be talking about today are in ash. So ash dieback is a fungus, as all of you know, that used to be found in East Asia, but now is found in Europe and is killing our ash trees. Whereas in China, for example, it doesn't kill the native ash trees. Similarly, emerald ash borer, a beetle from East Asia, now found in Eastern Europe, and in America, and particularly in America is causing huge devastation of native ash populations. And this has knock-on effects for biodiversity. In the UK alone has 955 species associated with it, and of them 45 are obligate. They have to have ash in order to survive. And so in the future we need ash trees which are not only adapted to a changing climate in the UK, but also adapted to an invasive fungus, ash dieback, potentially also adapted to an invasive insect, emerald ash borer, which thankfully isn't here yet, but could be in coming years. And ideally, they would also support UK native species as well. So how do we achieve this? Well, one way is to think about the global diversity of ash trees. Ash as a genus has about 40 species in it. These are found throughout the world. Some of them look extremely similar to one another. Some of them only really have different species names because they're found in different parts of the world. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, ones found in the native ranges of ash dieback and the emerald ash borer actually have some resistance to them. So one solution to the plant health crisis that we have, that's the result of the blending of worldwide pests and pathogens, is to blend worldwide host plants, or if not at the species level, at the genomic level. We could draw on genomic variation found throughout the world, for example, ash, and use that, some of which of course encodes the ability to resist and coexist with emerald ash borer and ash dieback, to allow our native ash or renewed, revitalized populations of ash here to be able to resist pests and pathogens that at the moment they're not able to resist. So one of the strands of work in my lab over the past few years has been to investigate this possibility. So we sequenced the genomes of 29 species of ash from around the world. We did this mainly from collections in botanic gardens like Kew and arboreta like Western Birch. And then we made a phylogenetic tree to understand how they were related to each other. And then we tested the susceptibility of the different species to emerald ash borer in collaboration with researchers at the USDA in Ohio. And we also compiled data about their susceptibility to ash dieback and set up a trial with Forest Research. And as expected, we found that Asian species were more resistant to emerald ash borer than other species, particularly the American ones. So this chart just shows you the mean proportion of larvae that were killed within wood of the different trees, larvae of emerald ash borer by the trees. So you can see that some of these trees from China, like Fraxinus platypoda and Fraxinus manchurica, they're killing over 80% of the larvae that hatch from eggs of emerald ash borer. So they're highly resistant to them. They have the ability to poison these larvae. Whereas Fraxinus excelsior is here somewhere in the middle, if you can see my cursor, able only to kill a very small proportion of those larvae. And so we used this fact to compare the genomes of the resistant species together. And because these different resistant species are found in very different places in the evolutionary tree of the genus Fraxinus, by comparing them, we can actually identify places where they're unexpectedly similar, which we hypothesize are places that encode resistance to this common threat that they've all had over very many generations of emerald ash borer and ash dieback, all of these Asian species. And by doing this, we identified various places in the DNA of these ash trees that we think are encoding resistance to emerald ash borer and ash dieback. And in particular for emerald ash borer, we found that there were several hits to something called the phenyl propanoid biosynthesis pathway. And this seems a very plausible link because the products of this pathway are products that are often used to poison insect pests by trees. So we think we've got candidate genes for resistance to emerald ash borer. So the question then is, well, how do you actually use this knowledge to allow ash in Britain to resist emerald ash borer? Well, one very simple way would be to grow Asian species of ash in Britain, such as Fraxinus manchurica, which is a timber species in China and actually looks reasonably similar to Fraxinus excelsior. But then there are questions, of course. Well, would Fraxinus manchurica be adapted to our climate in Britain? Would they be able to support local species? And if we weren't careful, could we bring in other pests and pathogens with them? Obviously, a lot of biosecurity would be needed in establishing the planting stock. All of those are questions that would need to be answered. But perhaps that is one simple way forward for very rapidly having ash populations which are resistant to both emerald ash borer and ash dieback. Another approach is hybrid breeding. Crossing Asian species with Fraxinus excelsior. Obviously, reproductive barriers would need to be overcome, and we'd have to think carefully about adaptation to climate and to the support of local biodiversity. Many of you will know that hybrid breeding programs have been attempted many times for elms, and there are hybrid elms that are resistant to Dutch elm disease. And some people love them, some people hate them. Some people don't think they're an adequate replacement for the English elm. Other people are happy with them. So there's social aspects as well to the acceptability of these different possible solutions. Another approach would be to do genetic engineering. We could genetically engineer UK ash trees to have the variants that we think encode resistance to emerald ash borer and ash dieback. That would be a major program. It would involve a lot more research and work, but it is technically possible now. But again, public acceptability issues of genetic engineering, especially released into the natural environment. So all of these approaches are surrounded by a certain amount of controversy. All of them are difficult, all of them are expensive, and of course, it's much better to prevent pests and pathogens coming into the country in the first place. And we need to do everything we can to stop emerald ash borer coming into Britain. It's found in Western Russia at the moment, and perhaps in Ukraine as well. And we need to really make sure that we don't accidentally introduce it into Britain, because we don't know how bad it could be. This is just the list of people who are involved in that particular piece of work. And what I've said here was actually was the basis of a talk I gave last September at the International Plant Health Conference in London. And that's actually on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it or share it. I guess these slides might be shared afterwards and you can click on that link. But most of our research over the last few years and our ongoing research is less focused on non-native species of ash, but much more focused on UK native ash species and seeking to understand the genetic basis within them of ash dieback resistance. And so this is a topic that will take up the majority of my talk. Resistance that's already found in UK ash populations. Now, a few years ago, a postdoc with me called Tim Coker did a study of death rates of ash across Europe. We actually did this a couple of years before it eventually got published in 2018 in Plants, People, Planet. We did it as a report for DEFRA, and it was in the grey literature for quite a while before we actually managed to get it into a journal. And we simply looked at sites across Europe where people had recorded death rates for ash, and looked at how many years those sites had been exposed to ash dieback. Because, of course, in 2012, when ash dieback was found in Britain, it had already been found for many years in other parts of continental Europe. And we fitted a very simple model to that data to try to predict how many trees would die in the future. And I'll just read out what we wrote in conclusion in 2018. The model for data from natural woodlands cannot exclude the possibility of 100% mortality within 30 years, but predicts that mortality between 50 and 75% is more likely given the current available data. But in planted trials, mortality could reach 100%. And for young trees, for natural regen, we just couldn't be sure. So more research was needed. But I would emphasize that, you know, back in 2018, we weren't predicting 95% of trees would die. We were saying at that point 50 to 75% would actually die. Of course, more than that will be affected by ash dieback, but this is about ones that would fall over and die. And I think so far I'd be interested to hear your experiences, because you're much closer to the action, many of you, than I am, of what's actually going on in 2023 on the ground. But I'd be interested to know if you have seen anywhere with mortality rates above 75% that are, you know, that are solely due to ash dieback and not due to preemptive felling and health and safety felling, etc. Perhaps that's something we could discuss later. But the point I'm coming to is that the fact that 100% aren't dying is partly because there is some genetic resistance in the ash population that is already allowing some to survive. Now, it's not entirely due to that. It's also because some are growing in much better environments than others. They have the nutrients and the consistent water supply, etc., that they need to be able to overcome the fungus. Some of them are just lucky, but some of the survival is due to genetics. And so we did a genome-wide association study to try to understand where in the DNA of our ash trees the genes are that are giving them, some of them, a degree of resistance to ash dieback. And genome-wide association studies were really developed for humans, for study of things like diabetes and other human traits. But it's a great technique to apply to trees because in many ways trees are quite similar to work on as humans. They have long generation times. It's hard to set up crosses. We don't have breeding lines, etc. And so this was a really good technique to be able to use on ash trees. We'd already sequenced the genome of an ash tree, and so it was a case of then looking at many more ash trees and comparing those that are resistant to ash dieback, that are more resistant to those that are less resistant. And to do this, we were very fortunate in that Forest Research in 2012 had set up some mass screening trials. This was led by Steve Lee, who used to lead breeding for Forest Research. 150,000 trees had been collected up from nurseries who could no longer sell them and planted out in the southeast of England at 14 different sites. There were 15 different provenances, many of them UK native seed zones. And these were planted out, and the trees were scored in 2016 for their ash dieback damage. So a score of 7 meant a tree that was still healthy, and then scores of 1, 2, and 3 were different ways of being dead, and 4, 5, and 6 intermediate categories. And here's the results in 2016 with the more healthy trees shown in green. And you can see that from all of the provenances, there were a very low number of trees that still seem to be completely healthy. Now, subsequent to this, most of those trees have since shown some symptoms, some even quite severe symptoms. But the fact that in 2016, after being in the ground for over 3 years, surrounded by trees that were damaged or dying, it suggests they had a degree of resistance. So they were worth looking at to see what genetic variants they had within them that were enabling them, helping them to stay healthy. And so what we did was we looked at 38,000 of these trees in the following couple of years, and we selected about 625 trees that were still looking completely healthy. They were the only ones we found that were still looking completely healthy. And then each of those trees we paired with an unhealthy tree from the same provenance. And then, to cut a long story short, we sequenced all of the trees, and then we compared the healthy and the unhealthy trees, taking into account their provenance. And this enabled us to find variants of genes that were more common in the healthy trees than in the unhealthy trees. And that was our genome-wide association study. So there's the what we call a Manhattan plot, where you see a line of dots coming up out of the mass of dots at the bottom. These are identifying places in the genome where there are letters of DNA, where there's more than one letter in the population, and one of the letters is more common in healthy trees and the other is more common in unhealthy trees. And so these are locations in the genome that seem to be associated with resistance to ash dieback. And when we started looking closely at these and looking at the genes that were near them, some of these genes had been found before in other plants and associated with things like pathogen resistance. And so these seem to be promising candidates for involvement in resistance to ash dieback. I've just got a couple of examples there. But then what we did was we said, well, can we now predict how resistant a tree is based on its genome? Can we do genomic prediction? And so we took 150 trees, 75 healthy and 75 unhealthy, and these were trees that hadn't been involved in the original genome-wide association study. And then for each of these, we used the information from the genome-wide association study to predict the health of each individual tree. And we found that for trees that actually were healthy, from their genomes alone, we were giving them slightly higher breeding values on average than trees that were unhealthy. And so to some extent, we were able to predict on average the health of trees based on their genomes. And if we took that group of trees and gave them all a genomically estimated breeding value, so an estimate based on their genome alone of how healthy we thought they should be, if we then just took the top 20% of those, then the majority of them really were healthy trees. And we could do this with different numbers of letters of DNA in the genome, and in general, the more letters we used, the more accurate our prediction was. And this was published in a paper in 2019 called Genomic Basis of European Ash Tree Resistance to Ash Dieback Fungus. So one thing we said in the paper was, well, if we wanted to, we could now do a breeding program for ash dieback resistance, where, as well as looking at the health of the parent trees, we could also look at their genomically estimated breeding value and select them based on that, as well as their current health. And that's a method that is used a lot in breeding for agriculture, both of arable crops and of livestock, and has led to very rapid gains in things like milk yield in dairy herds. So this is a method that has a lot of potential for ash if we wanted to have an accelerated breeding program. But then we thought, well, okay, we could do a breeding program, but maybe natural selection is already doing the job for us in the wild. So our next step was to take this into a wild population. And our study on this is available on bioRxiv. It's a preprint. We haven't yet published it in a journal. We're working on that at the moment. And what we did was we looked around for a woodland that had quite a lot of natural regeneration of ash within it and was pretty undisturbed, where we knew it was a very old ash population. And we also wanted something that wasn't too far from Kew, so that we didn't have to spend lots of time staying in bed and breakfast when we did field work. And we found Marden Park Wood in Surrey, which is belongs to and is run by the Woodland Trust. A really nice old ash population, lots of natural regeneration. And we found a patch with lots of old ash and lots of regeneration. Here's a map of it. You can see the size of tree according to the size of the circles. Here's a picture of what the canopy looked like. So obviously heavy ash dieback. And we went through and we scored every tree for its ash dieback symptoms and for its size, and we collected material for DNA extraction. And here's two PhD students, Will and Carey, both doing that sampling. And for the large trees, we used percentage canopy cover as our estimate of ash dieback damage. Not an ideal measure, but the best we could do in a short length of time. We're experimenting with using drones for this sort of thing, but for the moment, we're just relying on standing on the ground and eyeballing the canopy. And here you can see 2019 and 2021. You can see the number of trees with greater than 75% estimated canopy cover has dropped, as have all the other measures of tree health over that time. Then for the small trees, we did a health score that was very similar to the health scores we used for the planted trials. But this time we did 1 to 5. If a tree was dead, we just had one category of dead trees this time. And you can see that there were quite a number of very healthy trees in 2019. This had dropped in 2021 somewhat. You can also see a lot went missing. Partly that was due, unfortunately, to our tags going missing, but it was also partly due to whole saplings going missing. So with over 600 trees, with the samples we collected, we sequenced their genomes and we looked at the genetic diversity. And we particularly looked at 10,000 places in the genome which had provided good genomic predictions of resistance in our previous study on the field trials. And one thing we found straight away was that the population we were studying was fixed for a single allele associated with high set susceptibility at more than 900 loci. So for 900 of the 10,000 loci that we know are associated with resistance, we knew that this population was stuck with the variant that is associated with high susceptibility. So unless variation is brought in from outside this population, those 900 loci will never change. So there's another way of stating this is there's lower genetic diversity in this single population than there is in the field trials we looked at. And that, of course, is not surprising because the field trials were sourced from all over the UK. Then we calculated a genomically estimated breeding value for each individual and compared that to our measure of how badly they'd got ash dieback in the field. And so I'm showing the data here both for adults and juveniles, and there's not a correlation between the two. So for an individual tree, we could not give an accurate prediction of how healthy or unhealthy it would be just based on its genome. Now, that might sound very disappointing, but actually it's not surprising, because in a natural population, in a natural woodland, you have huge variation of local micro environment. So some trees are going to be in a place where they have less competition. Some are going to be in a damp patch. Some are going to be in a place where a fox died 5 years ago. So there's lots of nutrients. There's so much variation in a natural woodland, and all of that is going to be affecting how healthy the trees are. So on an individual basis, it's not surprising that we're not able to give good predictions. However, what was very interesting was when you take all of the adults and all of the juveniles and look at the average genetically estimated breeding value for adults versus juveniles, we found that the juveniles have a slightly higher genomically estimated breeding value. So on average, we predict that juveniles are slightly more resistant to ash dieback than adults. And I won't explain the lower chart. It shows that in a different way, but I'll just talk about the upper chart. But the way we did the lower chart, which is quite complicated, allowed us to test the statistical significance, and it was significant. So our understanding of this is that natural selection seems to be already selecting for higher resistance in the juveniles. And that makes sense, because there's lots of other data showing that juveniles die more quickly from ash dieback if they get it than adults, because adults are so big, they can hang on for many years fighting with the fungus, whereas with a juvenile, the fungus can more quickly take over the whole plant and kill it off. And another thing that would be driving this is adults that are susceptible and infected will be setting less seed and producing less pollen, and so they'll be contributing less to the juvenile population as well, even though the adult itself is still alive. Another thing we looked at was for a subset of the trees, we were actually able to connect parents with their actual offspring. And so we could then compare the health of the parents with the health of the offspring. And so in this top chart, on the horizontal axis, we've got the canopy cover of the parent tree, so our measure of how resistant the parent tree is to ash dieback, against the health score of their offspring, just looking at how badly affected they are. And you can see there's no relationship between the two. If there were, we'd be seeing a line of 45 degrees. More healthy parent trees would be having more healthy offspring. We're not seeing that. Again, not too surprising, because of the huge amount of environmental variability within the population at a microsite level. However, if we took the genomically estimated breeding value of the parent trees and compared that with the phenotypic measure of the health of their offspring, we did find a relationship. And so the genomically estimated breeding value of the parent trees was a better predictor of how well their offspring would be doing than was the canopy cover of the parent tree. And so that does suggest that these genetic measures of resistance are a very worthwhile thing to measure if you're thinking of doing a breeding program. Just to go out into the natural environment and collect seed from trees that have got good canopy cover isn't necessarily going to mean that you find seed that are going to resist ash dieback better, because there are so many different environmental variables in the wild that are affecting how healthy a tree is. So here's a reference again to that preprint. So is natural selection going to be the solution? Well, we have found some evidence for natural selection happening, but it's a very slight shift. So is that alone going to rescue our ash populations? How do we think about this? Well, we have to remember that the interaction between a host and a pathogen also involves local environment. So we've got the disease triangle of pathogen, host, and environment. And then to think about what's going to happen in the future, we have the breeder's equation, the change in the mean value of a trait. So in this case, the change in the level of ash dieback resistance is going to be equal to S, which is the selection differential, how quickly ash dieback is killing trees, but also the heritability of the trait. That is the amount of variation in the health of a tree that's due to genetics versus due to the environment. And with ash dieback, we think the environment is having a huge level of effect. And so this is going to actually slow down natural selection a great deal. And so just thinking it through, there are quite a lot of hindrances to natural selection for ash dieback resistance in our woodlands. So we have large environmental effects, low heritability of ash dieback resistance. Secondly, incidence of ash dieback spores is patchy in local environments. And so in some areas, the selection differential is going to be lower than others. And of course, the more ash trees actually die, then the less ash dieback there's going to be around. And so over the whole country, the selection differentials are going to drop. There's highly overlapping generations with older trees slow to die. So we have a situation where there can be older trees that are that have really bad genes, but are still hanging on and still contributing to the younger generation. Blanket felling of ash by managers, that takes out trees with better genetics, as well as trees with bad genetics. Low genetic diversity in local populations, including fixation of alleles associated with resistance or susceptibility. That limits ash, natural selection. Only a very small subset of global ash diversity is present in the UK. And as I said in the first section of the talk, there's a lot of diversity out there that could be useful that we just don't have access to if we're only using UK ash populations. And then lastly, we have a lot of herbivores. And if you don't have natural regeneration happening, then you can't have natural selection happening. So we need natural regeneration for this to have any chance of working. And so in my view, we probably do need a breeding program and or introduction of ash from abroad if we're really going to tackle this issue. Now I can see that time's getting on, so I've got a few slides about some new work that we're doing under a new Centre for Forest Protection between Kew and Forest Research, funded by DEFRA. We're doing a lot of work to improve our knowledge of ash genomes, but I'll skip over that because I see we're running a bit low of time and I'd like to leave time for discussion. But I'll just mention one thing we're cautiously thinking about for the future, which we haven't started work on yet, is the idea of rapid cycle breeding, because I said that we can do genomic selection now in ash, and that helps us to accelerate breeding programs because we can pick out the best trees to be parents and the best offspring at a very young age. But we're still greatly hindered by the fact that ash wait about 10 years of their lives before they flower. And so the generation time is much greater than it is for something like wheat, which is commonly bred. Tree breeding is a very, very slow process, even with genomic selection. So what would be really nice to do would be to be able to induce ash to flower early. So we're already able to predict resistance of trees using genetics. That's one way of informing rapid breeding. But if we could also engineer ash trees to flower early, if they say flowered after a year of growth, a year after germinating, if they could flower, then we could run through many generations very quickly. Then in the final generation, you can remove the genes that cause them to flower early. And you end up with a tree that has no genetic modification in it, but has been through several generations of selective breeding from natural diversity and is hopefully more resistant. I applied for money to do this back in 2019 from BBSRC. It involved developing methods for genetic transformation of ash. Unfortunately, that was rejected by BBSRC, but subsequently and independently, some researchers at Rothamsted have actually managed to do genetic modification of ash, and so a lot of the heavy lifting is done. So now we're thinking through how we could then start to use that within ash to try to do rapid cycle breeding that uses GM through several generations, but then produces a non-GM ash tree at the end that has simply been bred in a traditional way. So just to try to sum up a little bit, we found some of the genetic basis for resistance to ash dieback and emerald ash borer in ash. We're continuing to work to find more. We've got some evidence for natural selection happening in a UK ash woodland. And this research opens up several possible ways forward, like breeding with genomic selection, hybrid breeding, rapid cycle breeding. And those are things I'd be very interested to discuss with you all, because of course, the acceptability of different approaches with the public and with stakeholders and with industry and with conservation groups is of course very, very important to their possible success and applicability to our woodlands. So finally, I'd just like to thank DEFRA and NERC for the vast majority of the funding for this, also other organisations whose logos are shown there, and I'm on Twitter and have a blog as well. So I'd be very happy to take questions and comments on all of that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Richard. That was really interesting and some quite science heavy stuff you explained in a very accessible sort of way. I get alarmed when I see lots of squiggly shaped grass and dots and stuff, and I think before we go over to, I don't know, Bronte, have there been any questions that have been posed by people typing, or is it?
It is. I think you've done such a good job of explaining that there are no questions in the chat.
Fair enough. Well, whilst we wait for hands to be raised, and I'll just go back to Richard. I just want to go and think what you mentioned about you're on the lookout for any woodland sites with over 75% ash that are actually dead because of ash dieback. Is that correct? So places not withstanding preemptive felling and everything else. So that's what you're on the lookout for.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to know what percentage of ash trees people think have actually died so far, because of course in 2012 a lot of people were saying 95% of our ash trees, or even 99%, are going to die, but in some ways that was right from the beginning, based on a bit of a misunderstanding of the experience on the continent. But it is quite hard to sort of really get accurate figures. So if anyone has a sort of accurate guess or impression of how many trees have actually died, or what proportion of trees have died, I'd be very interested. But maybe it's too hard a question.
Well, it's something we can certainly send out to all the members of the Tree Health group to see if they've seen any woodlands rather than recent plantations that have just got a really high proportion of death. Because I'd say I'd certainly agree with what you had in your presentation. For what I've seen in some of the sort of plantations from this turn of the century, there's certainly some woods which are more than 75% dead, but now I guess my observations are that they don't look quite so bad, because all the dead ones are fallen over and you're left with the
I think that there is definitely potential there for gene editing. I think looking at the number of loci involved, we would have to be editing large numbers of loci to be able to make a difference in many cases, unless we can identify one or two really key genes where just a small change can allow the plant to sort of divert a metabolic pathway so it starts to produce a chemical that it wasn't producing before, and which is a chemical that is produced by other ash trees, for example, in Asia. I think, though, in some ways, to do a rapid cycle breeding program might be better, because then you can be selecting across the whole range of natural variation that's out there already, and you could potentially get some very good results quite quickly without all of the extra risks and indeed controversy that would be associated with gene editing or genetic modification, actually releasing a GM or GE organism into the natural environment.
Okay, we've had, so I think something came in on chat. Bronte,
Yes.
I'll pass to you.
Just a message from Claire. She's a bit confused. You were talking about the juvenile trees showing slightly greater genetic resistance than mature trees. Just wondering if that was because there are more young trees compared to mature trees.
Yeah, well, so what we think has happened is looking at this woodland at a single point in time and comparing the juvenile trees that are alive compared to the adult trees that are alive, we're finding the average level of resistance in the juvenile trees is slightly higher. Now, we think that's because there's been a lot more death in the juvenile trees already. There's a lot of juvenile trees that germinated, grew into a sapling, got ash dieback and died. And so we're looking at a population of juveniles after a round of selection has happened. And of course, because the ash dieback fungus is producing spores on the forest floor in the fallen leaf litter from the previous year, inoculum levels are very high right near the ground where the young trees are growing. And also, once the fungus has got a grip on a young tree, it doesn't have much growing to do before the whole tree is dead. And so younger trees are getting more inoculation, they're dying more quickly. And so much stronger selection has happened on the younger trees than on the adult trees, because the adult trees can hang on for such a long time. And so that's why when we look at the existing young trees, only the ones with greater resistance are still alive. And that's how we think the shift has happened. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, I think it does. Okay, thank you. We've got a hand up with Fionn, I think.
Hello. Thank you ever so much, Richard. That was really, really interesting. And it's good to know that there's some hope on the genetic side of things. I just wondered, though, that if we were modifying the trees genetically, then is there a risk that we might introduce a response to pathogens that could be a risk to some of the species that rely on the ash tree? So other fungi and say some of the lichens and insects and things like that. And would we be able to check for that if that were the case?
Well, if we are introducing something that is already found somewhere else in an ash population, then you would hope that, you know, nothing too bad would happen as a consequence, because it's already part of the natural variation of ash. We're just taking a bit of a shortcut by doing gene editing or genetic modification instead of going through a breeding program. Having said that, if it was a variant that was only present, say, in China, and then we were introducing it into UK ash, well, we wouldn't know exactly what the consequences might be for other fungi that are native to the UK. Of course, you could test for that. It would be quite tricky, you know, it would be a long-term process, but you could check for that, or you could just monitor what you put out there. I think if you were introducing something that's completely new, like, for example, a gene from a stinging nettle and placing that into ash, then the consequences would be much harder to predict, because, you know, it would be a brand new thing, and who knows what would happen. So that, I think, would need more checking. On the other hand, at the end of the day, it depends what you want, because if ash tree populations, in a worst case scenario, disappear, if we have both emerald ash borer and ash dieback, and if we don't know if this is the case, of course, but if that meant that ash went extinct in the UK, then what would you rather have, no ash trees or an ash tree that doesn't support certain native fungi that used to be supported by ash? I mean, those fungi are going to be suffering a lot anyway. So I think at some point a sort of balance would have to be found, whereby you say, okay, it's not what we had before, it's not ideal, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, we've got a couple more minutes left. So thinking along that line, because of the introduction of the ash dieback fungus, we're already causing potentially the extinction of a obligate fungus for our native ash with the Hymenoscyphus albidus fungus that's just being outcompeted. So doing something is probably better than doing nothing. And I was just sort of going back to your slide, where saying that human intervention is going to be an essential, in your opinion, essential thing in the survival of ash. And so I guess that also means that, thinking back, was last year in December, we had Joe Clark presenting that it's still very worthwhile for everybody to be looking out for these tolerant trees in high quantities of spore situations, because without that, you're just going to be relying on less. So that'd be, sorry, that's not quite a question, but that's the sort of the gist I was getting from that slide.
Yeah. So I think we do need breeding programs like the program that Joe Clark is trying to initiate. Yeah, and I think we can enhance them by using the genetic knowledge that we have now as well. Yeah.
Right, we've got about 1 and a bit minutes left. Is there any last minute hands to go up? Because I know we need to keep to time here for Rich to also be able to keep to his times. But I guess the final thing is, is there any things in a? Oh, okay, we've got something online. So what's over to Bronte?
Yes, so that's another one from Claire.
You'll pick,
so not
pick
so
one
much
of
a
the.
question.
Pick one.
I got
Okay.
Tom. Are the young trees that are showing a degree of resistant enough to reach reproductive maturity?
Oh, we don't know yet. We don't know, unfortunately.
Nice quick answer.
Yeah.
And then the other question is about management. Are there still things worth doing? I think there are. Yeah, I mean, an ash population is definitely going to be better with low herbivory and natural regen happening. Yeah, that's the big issue, I think. And then one from John Pitcairn: are you looking at resistance or increasing tolerance? I find that pathologists go back and forth. Some people have very sort of strong views about a difference between resistance and tolerance. In this talk, I've been using resistance in a very general sense of anything that increases the health of a tree under ash dieback. So I'm not really distinguishing between resistance and tolerance in the way I've used the words in this talk.
And that sort of, I guess, highlights the why it's better to go and use genetic measures rather than canopy cover, because you can have trees that are very tolerant, but they shed some of their leaves because that's what they do, and that's sort of what happens normally. Right, so I'm going to go and call it a day there, and thank you very much, Richard. And that's excellent, and thank you very much for appearing and allowing us to record your presentation. And
Pleasure.
It's been fantastic. We're going to have to move it on now to invite Rich to go and join us now, Rich Hauer, because he's very kindly. Thank you very much, Richard. Once again, if people want to do virtual clapping and thank you of some sort of virtual thanks, it's really difficult when you go and present to a sea of blank audience. So thank you very much. But I'll move over to Rich now, because not only is he in a different continent, so it is particularly early in the morning, and but he's also going to be moving straight into lecturing as soon as we finish. So we must go and keep to time here. So I'll not provocate too much, but go into a quick introduction. So he's a professor of forestry at the College of Natural Resources at the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. He's also a visiting professor at Qingdao Agricultural University in Beijing Forestry University, and he's been teaching courses in most aspects of forestry, as far as I can see, from urban forestry to woody plants to dendrology, and he's got lots and lots of publications, including things such as the management of urban forests and urban tree risk management and risk assessing and developing management strategies for tree populations to respond to future and potential future tree pests and diseases. And he's got an interest in emerald ash borer, and so hopefully you'll be able to go and see a strong parallel with what's been going on on the other side of the Atlantic to our ash dieback situation. So if you're happy for me to pass you over, Rich, then I'll do so.
Thank you, Barnaby. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very clear.
Awesome. And my pleasure to be here speaking on emerald ash borer. And I'm a professor of urban forestry at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. But the interesting thing about urban forestry, there's so many different angles you can take. And really, the angle I've taken over the years is really about management. And there's a lot of different aspects of management. You know, I like to consider myself as kind of like my throwback to growing up on a farm. We're a master of most things. And or excuse me, you know a lot of things, but you're often not a master of most anything. And really, that's kind of the context of my life. So anyways, emerald ash borer, I got involved with this about a little over a decade ago, really asking the question from a management perspective, economics. But along the way, I never thought it'd be in a lot of different aspects of just the research and development of really management solutions to emerald ash borer. And so if we think about it, emerald ash borer or ash decline that you're working with is really, do you manage or not manage? And if you pick one of these two options, what's the worst that can happen is kind of the mentality that I like to think about. In emerald ash borer, for example, this insect, it operates fast. Now, it actually operates slower than people think. And you'll see some data here that kind of parallels your ash dieback, that it doesn't happen instantaneously overnight. It does have some time, although it seems like it happened overnight. And it doesn't matter if it's residential properties or trees in utility corridors or trees along streets. If you let ash manage on its own time frame, this is going to happen. And this is really a town in this just north of Chicago, Illinois. And don't know if they have a forester in this community. I'm suspecting not, because this town was totally unprepared for emerald ash borer. And the end result is trees along streets, trees in parks, and trees actually have perhaps habitat for insects to go after, or birds to go after the larva. But certainly given enough time, trees are going to go boom. They're going to fall to the ground. And now this is a huge risk aspect. So really, if you think about emerald ash borer, it's more than just the pest. It's more than just the management approaches we take, whether you do something or nothing. End results are going to occur. So that's going to be kind of the theme that you'll hear today in my presentation. And I'll tell you another thing from the research of myself and many others, there's really no one answer, but there's outcomes for any decision. And I often like to say, whatever decision you make certainly is the correct decision. It's the one you made. On the other hand, I could look at it and perhaps come up with some suggestions or recommendations of maybe how to tweak something, or maybe you're doing it better than anyone else. But regardless, there's really a lot of different possibilities and answers to this picture here. Really, I like to take a deep dive back and think about sustainability. And really, sustainability is all about thinking about people, certainly thinking about the environment, the actions we take, and thinking about certainly the economic aspects about it. And if we think about our knowledge of emerald ash borer and treatment, in the United States for that matter, we have treatments that within a decade of this insect first being found in this country that became very, very effective. For example, using a chemical emamectin benzoate and using a tree injection system such as right here, it's almost bulletproof. That trees that are treated with this in areas that are substantially infested with emerald ash borer, trees just don't die. They die at really the normal mortality rate for ash. So the chemistry here is really, really effective. It's also a very, very benign pesticide, because I often like to say I don't want to be the next chapter in a Rachel Carson book. If you've never seen that book, it came out in 1962. It's about the impacts of DDT on the environment. So certainly that's a huge, important background that we certainly want to avoid. And the other aspect, it's really about integrated management in a sense. It'd be wonderful if we could find biological agents, some sort of parasitoid perhaps, and that would just control emerald ash borer. Some of the research out there is some work, others work not as well, others don't work at all. And certainly perhaps integrated with perhaps chemistries, pesticides, and getting established the ones that actually work. And that could be another solution for the management of emerald ash borer. The other aspect is really a social decision. And if you think about the canopy, the layer of canopy of ash trees, for example, that there's some neighborhoods that have more ash and there's other neighborhoods that do not. So from a social equity perspective, thinking about it from that context, that if you do nothing, there's going to be some people that will have less canopy than others. Now, another aspect on the social decision-making certainly is the pesticides that I mentioned, and certainly the aspect of some people would rather not have pesticides in the environment. And so certainly that's a social decision. But as you'll see, there's also a social decision of not treatment of ash and mortality. And so if we think about the social aspect, though, it probably doesn't surprise you, people love big trees. And so this is some research that came out of the University of Minnesota, and the lead author actually is Arne Arnberger from Austria. But Arne, working with Ingrid Schneider, who's with the University of Minnesota, they asked the social decision of people, what would you rather have? What would you desire? And they found people like mature trees. That doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise you. But they did find that certainly if you do have emerald ash borer infestations in the early stages, still the forests were socially desirable, and they're actually okay with management. And so thinking about the management aspects that we have, in this case pesticides, they're okay with management of some sort of type. They don't like large ash that are gone, and they don't like large ash that have been removed that are actually not removed, still standing with trees planted. So they'd rather have, from aesthetics perspective, certainly that's an important social decision. The other aspect is thinking of the social decision-making is people would rather not have you do nothing. So that was the least desirable outcome. They'd rather have some management occurring, and they'd rather take things that did not use chemicals. However, on the other hand, they were moderately tolerant for some sort of chemical treatment to actually control emerald ash borer, but they'd prefer if something magical like wood regulations would stop it. And certainly that's a really important role. One of my previous jobs, I worked for a regulatory agency where we would do like phytosanitary certificates and really slow the spread of any pathogens or insect problems around the world. And then the ecology perspective. This is some work I did with Dutch elm disease. And what we actually found was, interesting enough, the stormwater value itself would actually pay for the management of Dutch elm disease sanitation, which is nice in this case. For Dutch elm disease, sanitation works. For emerald ash borer, chemical treatment is the only option we have right now. Hopefully something in the future will be different. Hopefully, as Dr. Buggs was talking about, perhaps resistance for emerald ash borer will be somehow either integrated into the ash population by humans or just natural mechanisms in nature, perhaps both of those. But the aspect here is there's so many other environmental benefits. These same principles apply for ash tree canopies. Now, this is where I really got into emerald ash borer management. I was really curious about what was the impact of just emerald ash borer economically on our campus tree population. So I had a couple undergraduate students who actually got involved with me, Andy Valnata, and Nate Schupeltz. And really, we're just really curious about what was the value of the ecosystem benefits lost. And then we got, the more we got into this, the more questions we started asking. And then we actually did an economic analysis to find out what was the effect of different options. And so from doing nothing to getting rid of all your ash and replanting versus treatment or preemptive removal. So if you look at this data and you just look at the cost aspect, which a lot of people often do, what is the cost of this problem? Actually, the most economically favorable is get rid of all your ash trees and don't replant them. Actually, that's the solution for any urban forest management. If you want the lowest cost, don't have trees. Now that seems kind of silly, right? But there's some truth to that. But why do we have trees, or why do we have universities? Because they provide value. So that was the context of that paper. So when we brought in such as net present value and looking at the values of trees from these ecosystem benefits and aesthetic benefits for that matter versus the cost of management options. Well, actually, the most desirables don't have emerald ash borer, which doesn't probably surprise you. But the next most favorable was actually treatment. And so from that perspective, this was kind of a hallmark, and this paper has since been replicated 5 additional times where other researchers have found the same thing. The cost of treatment with the chemicals and the treatments we have is really low cost versus the value of trees and the ecosystem benefits, et cetera. And actually, we built a simulator to make all this stuff work a lot easier. When we first started working, like a lot of research, you find inefficient ways to get it done, then you find efficiencies. Really, we built a simulator to the economic modeling. So if you're curious, you could contact me and I'll get you a copy of it. There's also a calculator that really started the whole idea of emerald ash borer management. Cliff Sadow's calculator was really instrumental of, for example, our work adding the addition of what is the benefit. So Cliff's initial model was let's look at the cost of treatment options, which is really important. And that actually paved the way for us looking at more than just the cost, also the benefit side and doing things such as net present values. Now, so what we learned from all this, not only our work, but certainly others, is active management is better than no management. And that's just is just not for emerald ash borer. I would suspect it's the same thing for ash decline. It's the same thing certainly for Dutch elm disease. We knew that very well. There's a rich history in the literature of that, not only in North America, but certainly in Europe and beyond. But active management is better than no management. And it's interesting, a lot of the papers have came out of just the impact of emerald ash borer. So if, for example, can emerald ash borer affect the crime rate? Now you sit back here and think, it's like, how can an insect affect crime? Well, interesting enough, Cincinnati, Ohio, what they found was in areas of emerald ash borer, crime rate actually went up. Where they did not have emerald ash borer, the crime rate in this area had been going down over time. And so where ash were not being removed because of there's perhaps not a high ash population, or it was in a community that was being treated, regardless, the crime rate, there was a significant difference. So interesting enough, if you dig into the crime literature, there's actually the broken window theory, which there's some theory that areas that look blighted have higher crime rates. So if buildings are in disrepair, and it's interesting enough, it's like criminals do care. And it's kind of this psychology of, if you don't care, why should I care? And so actually in the communities that had fewer ash or less canopy because of emerald ash borer, because they had ash trees, they had a neighborhood that looked not as nice as one that had large mature trees. Thinking back to Ingrid Schneider's work with Arnie, that it kind of makes sense from that perspective. And then the other aspect, you get into the routine activity theory, but basically some of these neighborhoods where ash actually increased from maybe just regeneration coming off the stump, or actually just natural regeneration of spindly trees, the neighborhoods did not look as well. The other interesting thing is there was a relationship between trees and human health. So areas that actually had emerald ash borer, actually as time progressed, lower respiratory disease and also cardiovascular related mortality increased. And here's just some odds ratios that Jeff Donovan actually put together. Now, it's not a causation study, it's certainly correlation. And Jeff was criticized by people. It's like, well, this isn't causation. And Jeff never said that, it's correlation. But if you take a dive back and you think about it, what could possibly be happening is you have less leaf area. less canopy area, less particulate matter being held, less air pollution being taken up. So these are all certainly drivers that could actually affect the health of people, but not healthy people. It's certainly people that already have pre-existing conditions were dying at a higher rate, perhaps 1 or 2 years sooner than they would without the loss of canopy from emerald ash borer. So we're going to get into some of the work that we've actually been involved with and thinking about emerald ash borer and the management implications. So taking a dive back to Dutch elm disease, this is City of Milwaukee. And the reason I mention them is I've done work both with emerald ash borer and also looking at Dutch elm disease. And we did some modeling, for example, what's the impact if we could retain, this is all American elm canopy in the City of Milwaukee. And this is what happens after Dutch elm disease unfortunately came there in 1956. And by 1969, most of the trees were gone. And this is pretty similar in many cities throughout North America where they didn't have the science. The science didn't come in until the 1970s. So really Milwaukee wasn't able to do anything, but we did the aspect of what if they could have. And we found actually that's where the stormwater would have paid for just the sanitation program alone, which I thought was really fascinating. And actually it took 40 to 50 years to recover the canopy. Now what's interesting is they went from a street tree right away, heavy lined tree population to actually the canopy spread throughout residential and private lands along with the public right of way. Now, one of the studies that actually came out of some work where I asked municipalities of what are they doing for emerald ash borer treatments? What are they doing just overall for managing their ash population? We actually were able to develop a paper looking at the impacts of emerald ash borer and municipal forestry budgets. And interesting enough, this graph probably would not have happened if I wasn't screening data and going, how are people in Illinois spending about 3 to 4 times as much money on average that other municipalities are? Are they providing data that wasn't factual? So I was asking foresters of what are they doing for their forestry operations in municipality? And I started wondering, it's like, well, could emerald ash borer do an impact? So I actually just created a data set that I took the data that communities were providing me. Oh, by the way, I actually verified this data looking at their financial reports that they submit annually for just a counting of the fiscal situation in the community, and found the data that people in Illinois were reporting to me was certainly what was on their financial records. And I spent about a week of my time actually just verifying just that one question in this study that we're doing. But I was really curious, did emerald ash borer have an impact? So I just added into our data set, when was emerald ash borer first introduced to a state at the state level? And what we determined was over time, the first 0 to 5 years, there's really no impact. And then the impact becomes great. And actually, after about 8 to 10 years, it starts becoming back to kind of what it was in the past, and maybe a little bit higher because of maybe replanting trees. Interesting enough, this really follows the mortality curve that Dr. Dan Herms put together. And it was interesting seeing the curve of ash decline that actually mirrors the same thing of what we just saw with emerald ash borer, that within about 5 to 10 years, you lose most all your ash. Between years 0 and 5, the population of the pathogen is building up, and then it actually comes back to normal when all the trees are primarily dead from being killed, in this case from emerald ash borer. We also are curious of the financial aspect, and what we found was, not surprisingly, states that actually had emerald ash borer, so the gray bars here, actually had an increase of what they're spending to remove trees and remove stumps underneath them, which it kind of makes sense. If you have emerald ash borer and they're killing trees, you're spending money to remove them. Unfortunately, money spent on public education declined, money spending watering trees, training employees on safe operations, fertilizing trees for plant health perhaps, and pruning trees all declined. Interesting enough, there's no new money, so money would be reallocated from budgets on average from things that would promote healthy urban forests to things removing trees. Unfortunately, there's no increase in budget actually for tree planting. So you're having trees not only not being planted to replace those being removed, but you're also having trees that are not being maintained like they should. Interesting enough, this parallel was the same thing that occurred with Dutch elm disease in many communities in North America. Not all communities, but certainly on average, that was the story. Because in that case, there is often no new money, much as the case in municipal budgets now for emerald ash borer. What we did find was $1.50 per capita increase of budgets. And so if you look at states that have emerald ash borer versus those that did not, it was about $1.50 increase per capita, which is kind of nice. So if you're curious at the state level, what is the potential impact, and you have ash populations in your state similar to our study, you could just make a quick assessment of, boy, what is emerald ash borer really going to cost on a tree budget perspective? Now, $1.50 is also kind of nice to know, because if you look in the literature, for example, the state of Missouri in North America, they were asking the question of what are people willing to pay? And they had, you can slice and dice this in different population groups of communities, different genders. Interesting, females are willing to spend more money than males on urban forestry. If you have higher education, you're willing to spend more money than if you have no education, or I should say just a grade school education, which is interesting at that level. If they were more willing to pay nothing, and you have to pay me money to actually have trees. But really on the average here, if you look at overall, it was about $18 if you adjusted today's inflation. And when they did the study in the about 2005, it was about $11.56 people were willing to pay. So think about the $1.50 and what people are willing to pay. And actually, if you adjust it for inflation today, there is actually room in budgets and willingness of people to actually pay more money in a community to support the tree population. Now, the other aspect of managing for emerald ash borer is really urban forestry management 101. If we didn't have this pest, we'd still be maintaining ash tree populations, in some cases removing them because of such as brown rot. In this case, brown rot causing structural limitations and tree failures. In this case, this is in a high trafficked area. This is a tree we'd probably not want to retain just for safety of people. And so the aspect removing of a tree would make sense, regardless of emerald ash borer or not. And so if you do have emerald ash borer in an area, certainly it probably would not make sense to treat this tree, and certainly promoting safety in the population for humans certainly would. If you have small trees and they're in a poor state of condition, certainly retaining these probably would not make sense. Or trees that have been unfortunately damaged during sidewalk construction. First of all, there's mechanisms we can do to avoid this damage, but if this happened, certainly probably removal is the better option than trying to retain these trees that certainly may have some structural limitations, and tree failure just from reduction of the root system is one aspect, or the effect on just the health of the tree. Or trees that are large in small confined areas. Maybe it doesn't make sense to retain these. Or trees where they put concrete around the stem. So situations like this, you'd always be thinking. Or trees in small confined areas. Interesting enough, the town I live in, they're actually retaining these trees because this is really the only tree canopy they have in their downtown area. They have a monoculture of ash. So they're actually doing some management to retain trees. In the meantime, actually replacing trees as they normally die anyways. So there's a lot of options. The other option is just don't have trees in the downtown area. And certainly that's not a desirable outcome either. Or trees that are under utility lines, or again, damaged by construction, or trees that have maybe big cracks in them. I suppose you could use duct tape to actually keep the tree stable. Now, this is kind of a parody that someone put up on a tree to say, I've got this tree, supported now with duct tape, this magical elixir of all little ills and ails in society. But certainly the whole theme here was an urban forester in a municipal setting, in a residential setting, would always be looking at trees and making decisions. Is it a tree to retain, or is it a tree to actually promote its health? So another aspect is thinking about short-term retention of trees. In this case, it's an American elm that was retained in the 1970s. And in this case, actually sanitation in this community in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. And planting trees as replacements for those that did die. Interesting enough, this is an ash tree that was planted as a tree to replace an American elm here. Another aspect is that in these confined areas, maybe planting on the other side. So there's a lot of options here that we would do as urban forest managers anyways. Now here's a study that I got involved with. I actually call it my retirement study. We started 7 years ago. So in 13 years from now, I'll be about 70, and maybe it's a time to retire and let others, take over the torch for urban forestry research. And certainly there's a lot of cool urban forestry researchers in the world, but the context here was actually retaining ash tree populations, those that are healthy. Those that are not healthy, we wouldn't retain anyways, regardless of this insect or any other pathogens that are really susceptible or causing major mortality in tree populations. And then actually planting trees. So the whole idea here is maybe having no net loss of canopy over time. So perhaps the ash tree canopy is increasing, the canopy of the trees we're planting are increasing, but over time, we don't have a net decline in that 40 to 50 year increase of canopy, or to get back to where it was, what we found with the city of Milwaukee with Dutch elm disease losses. The other aspect is we know really well, and this is actually our data that just shows if you do nothing, trees are going to be less healthy. And so 0 is dead, 100% is a perfect tree that there's no structural issues, there's no forest health issues on it. And these are all trees that have been treated under different scenarios, different chemicals. Dinotephorin's one where you spray it on the bark, and it's pretty effective for smaller trees under 16 inches in English units. And imidacloprid, the same thing for smaller trees, pretty effective. For larger trees, you have to use emamectin. So we're actually trying a 2-year, which is normal, and then actually adding, what if you did it once every 3 years? Because that would reduce the cost of treatment by 50%. And actually what we found was there's no difference in condition rating. So my recommendation is don't go what the label says, treat trees every 2 years, treat them on a 3-year cycle. Fortunately or unfortunately, one of my colleagues, Cliff Sadoff, the one that came up with the cost calculator, actually beat us to the punch with a published paper. They found the same thing. Actually, a 3-year cycle is the same as a 2-year cycle. So the recommendation now is save money, reduce your budget for control by half. And already it's cost effective. Now it's even more cost effective. We could look another way, the thinning of canopies. And this is certainly the way you see the progression of whether it's ash dieback or whether it's from emerald ash borer, that as the insect starts infesting and causing just a damage to the xylem tissue, and water transport and other things are not operating in the tree, the canopies start thinning. And so 2016 is when emerald ash borer was found in our town. These are my controlled trees in the study, and these are all the trees that have actually been treated. And there is a statistical difference, if you're curious. Don't have p-values and all those fancy things, but there is statistically a difference between these, and these are standard error bars versus the treatments. And actually, since about 2018 is when we actually detected the difference. Mortality is another way to look at it. So those that have been not treated actually die at a higher rate. I'm expecting this year this to be up to about 50%. And the trees that have been treated certainly have much less mortality. Interesting enough, I had a little quandary. 2017, when we actually started our study and we had the last set of trees treated, we had a windstorm. Interesting, the day before the windstorm, we treated our last trees. Those trees actually went down in a windstorm. What would you do as a researcher? Actually toss them from the study? What if actually the windstorm came the day before you did your treatment? Certainly not having them in the study would make sense because you couldn't treat them. But oddly enough, the windstorm happened a day after we did the last treatment, and we decided to actually retain them in the study because this is like natural mortality anyways, whether it's windstorms, they're dying from many other issues that cause trees to die in urban and rural forests. So we actually left them in there in the study. I can tell you actually the mortality of these will actually increase next year in a few of these treatments, and actually predominantly the emamectin benzoate. It's not because if they're not working the treatments, it's actually because they're moving trees to tear a building down on our campus, actually that build another building on that site. So I'm losing some of my study specimens. So the mortality will go up, not because of emerald ash borer, but things such as windstorms and natural human removal of trees. Now, didn't surprise me, these findings I just showed you, because this parallels information that was discovered the first 10 years of emerald ash borer in North America, that if you do nothing, trees die, which doesn't probably surprise you. But if you do something, in this case, treat trees once every 5 years. So 20% of the trees are treated each year versus once every 10 years. And Deb McCulloch found perhaps even on a 5-year cycle, it's as effective as a 3 or 4 or a 2-year cycle for that matter. Now I'm going to get into the home stretch here, talking about, I told you about the sustainability part. I told you about urban forest management, all things we do naturally anyways as managers, regardless of having an insect or a pathogen that's really aggressive in killing trees. And treatment is really the only option we have right now. There are other things that are being looked at and experimented. For example, trying to come up with a sanitation approach. One interesting study was, could you use dogs or actually swine? Because their ability to detect scents at a really small level is really efficient. And so actually there's some evidence that, yes, the presence of emerald ash borer can be detected by animals. Also some acoustic properties where you could go up to a tree and put a acoustic sensor on the tree to actually determine the sound of that insect within the tree and make some conclusions of maybe sanitation, removal of that tree to reduce the population would make sense. But anyways, treatments that what we've been doing for actually, boy, about 15 years to a large extent. The city of Milwaukee that I talked about, they've actually treated their trees 5 to 6 times now. I'm going to actually end with that data and actually looking at dissections of trees we did this summer. But anyways, the work that initially was done to see what's the impact on the trees, and in a controlled setting, after one treatment, basically what they found was trees sealed over the wounds where a drill was put into the tree, a drill bit for that matter, and then actually apparatuses were put in the trees to actually allow the chemical to be put into the hole to be taken up by the tree. And basically this is some of the initial after one injection where you get some longitudinal discoloration of the tissue, and the radial spread is not as much. And this is really consistent with a lot of dissections and, you know, looking at the compartmentalization of either damage, dysfunction, or decay, as Alex Scheigel first built the model at in trees. And so this is just how I respond. And another study done by Deb McCulloch and her student, where they found the same effect, that wounds close over really well. You have very little bark cracking, but I got to put a caveat on this. This is in controlled studies where academics are actually looking at what is the effect if you're following the manufacturer's recommendations. And really what happens if you look at like the spread from a cross-sectional perspective, it's like your pinky and your thumb. That's really what it looks like for each little injection location. And by the way, from an English unit perspective, for every 2 inches diameter or every 5 centimeters from a SI perspective, you have one injection site. So if I've got a 20 centimeter large tree, I'm going to have only 4 locations where I'm drilling into the tree to get the chemical, and it's pretty effective from that perspective. However, let's look at the aspect of what happens when you have practitioners doing the work, and it's not a controlled setting. They're in a production perspective. They're trying to do as much work as possible. They're trying to follow manufacturers' recommendations, but really it's kind of like production assembly line work on the treatment of trees for protection of them from emerald ash borer in this case. And so these are actually bark cracks and necrosis of the tissue in areas that actually had injections put into them. And so these are certainly, I could show you other locations on the tree where injection occurred and there's no external effects, but we're really curious of how significant is this. So we did a study on just the external wounding. And in some cases, when we did our initial training of the practitioners that were working with us, the students to do the assessments of trees in the field, some cases it's kind of tricky. And if you're not careful looking at the tree at the base, and we looked all the way up to 90 centimeters up on the tree, that you can actually miss something. So we used a rubber mallet as one tool. It's a typical technique that arborists use these days anyways for sounding of trees, and you can hear the difference of a hollow tree versus a sound tree. In areas that have, for example, bark cracking right here, you could easily detect, and you have to then peel this back. So you could actually measure the surface area of how much wound you have, and actually is it associated with the wound. Here we can actually see a plug of one of the type of treatments we have. In this case actually is also pretty obvious where we didn't have to remove the bark. But actually, I won't get into all the data that we have on this, but interesting enough, we found the biggest driver explainer for why we're seeing these external wounds, these bark cracks, these necroses, is practitioners did not follow manufacturer's recommendations. So there's something about the recommendations in the manufacturer of, for example, how deep one of the treatments is actually putting a plug in the tree. There's another approach where you actually don't put a plug in the tree, you have just an open hole. And interesting enough, not following the manufacturer's recommendations. And there's BMPs on the matter of how to inject trees, how to do it properly. For example, if a plug system is being used, you don't want to have it too deep, you don't want to have it too shallow. So here's one too shallow, here's some bark cracking that's associated with it. And you really want to have the plug sit flush with the cambium. And there's ways to do it. The thing though is it's easy. It's from our observations from the data that we have right here, it's actually pretty easy to properly do these things. So maybe that's a training situation, maybe emphasizing how important of the proper application of this treatment is to actually avoid bark cracking, for example. Now that leads us to the last study we have here. And this was one that we started 2 years ago, and we did our dissections this summer. And we ended up selecting 60 trees randomly from the city of Milwaukee, and we were able to, statistically, we only needed about 40 to really detect if there was a difference or not. And when you get into any research project, many of you actually listening here today can probably resonate with this. You have kind of an idea of how much time it'll take. And then when you start doing the research, reality hits, and it takes sometimes way longer than you anticipated. I can tell you, from finding a tree, selecting it, actually randomly selecting it from a tree population, in this case of 26,000 ash, of locating the trees and actually finding them, do they qualify actually for a study, or is there something about the site that there's too many external variables that we want to eliminate? And then actually having people cut the trees down and shipping them to our research location, and then actually starting the dissections, and then planing trees and sanding them so we can actually scan them with ImageJ software, and then actually digitizing how much of the discoloration we have compared to the total cross-sectional area, 20 hours per tree. Okay, it probably a little bit more than that now when we start writing the scientific work up in papers and things like that and giving presentations like this today. But just getting to the point to actually getting to an academic paper, 20 hours per log. So 800 hours of time just invested just to get a data set that we can actually write papers from. Here's the Jolly team from last summer. And another thing is we thought we'd dissect all our trees in one day. Nope, it took us about 3. And 3 versus 1 doesn't seem like a lot, but man, when it's 100 degrees out Fahrenheit, it is a miserable time when you're trying to dissect trees and you're like, boy, I wish this would be over today. But anyways, all these good things eventually come to an end. And this is our pile of just one of our days of processing. And so 40 trees, there's 6 actually tree cookies. These are English units. So here, 0 to 15 centimeters, for example. So they're 15 centimeter thick cookies. And we're looking at the discoloration. I'll show you images of those here in a second. But yeah, it takes a lot of time. And these are the 2 practitioners that did a lot of the work of actually the sanding, the planing them, so we can actually get a scanned image into ImageJ. And here's actually the implications of, this is data from just a week ago that we finally got all our images scanned, and then actually figuring out how much of the cross-sectional area actually has discoloration. And this is actually at the ground. This is at the 15 centimeter, or this is at the ground, this is at 15 centimeters, 30 centimeters, etc. And basically what we found is in one case, we had maybe an outlier tree that right at the ground level where we did the examination for discoloration, we had almost 50% of the cross-sectional area that had discoloration. Okay, and there's some implications and some reasons why that I'll get into here in a second, but for most trees, it was less than 20% on average. And these are the areas where most of the injections actually occur, within 0 to about 15 centimeters or so. And ideally, the recommendations say get as close to the ground as possible. But the nice thing is if you look at just this data here, is the longitudinal spread of discoloration becomes very, very minimal. In some cases, it was so hard to detect at the top of the tree, at 90 centimeters, for example, any effect from injections that were done down here. All right. Now, this also doesn't surprise me that in ash, that they're really good compartmentalizers, because previous studies have said this. In this case, we're using Fractionis pennsylvanica, our native green ash in North America. And this is a study from the same species, Fractionis pennsylvanica, that the longitudinal spread is very minimal relative to a couple other tree species. Here it's sugarberry, it's Celtnus lavigata, it's a southern species in the United States. And that one is a poor compartmentalizer. Green ash is a pretty good one. And this is just some examples of cookies. And so from our first day of cutting on the back of a Honda Odyssey tailgate session here, is most of the trees are really good, showing examples of strong compartmentalization. Some are moderate, and some actually, which were much weaker to the aspect, they actually merged into false heartwood. And this whole thing's a mystery to us. In green ash, Fractionis pennsylvanica, we can find 0 studies that actually talk about false heartwood. Now in Europe, Fractionis excelsior, I do believe you actually do have some papers that have looked at false heartwood. But even if we look at those papers and try to figure out what's happening here, we actually have no understanding. So if you actually have any understanding about this, contact me, because we're at a mystery here. Maybe there's a collaboration involved that we kind of somehow figure out how this false heartwood and these wounds are merging together. And so, for example, here's false heartwood. And false heartwood in trees, if you don't know what that is some trees naturally develop heartwood, others do not. For example, walnut, juglans, that's a natural heartwood producing tree. Many of the Cupressaceae members, such as coastal redwood trees in North America. They do produce a natural age-altered wood that is heartwood, that's discolored. Where in the case of other trees, if they get wounded, they'll become discolored. In the case of ash, if you prune a lot of branches, you can cause a necrosis inside the tree to cause false heartwood. That's one potential cause that's been elucidated. And but anyways, how these wounds here from actually injections, for example, again, if they don't merge with this interior false heartwood, it's like your pinky and your thumb in kind of a size perspective. Another angle that we put in here, I don't have data, we just got the data back actually looking at fungal assays. And so in these locations, what fungal communities are actually in the tree? We're also looking at some tree phenolics. And these are all things that have been kind of added after we saw this mystery like false heartwood. So I don't have anything to report on that, just to say the elevator message, if you'd ask me in 30 seconds or less, seen 10 years is the take home of this study, is these ash compartmentalize so well. We saw really no evidence of much decay. Visually, in a few cases, we did see some evidence of maybe decay occurring. That's why we added that fungal assay component. Now on the home stretch here, this just shows an example of, for example, bark cracking. And so a treatment where the plug maybe wasn't put in far enough is in some of these samples you can see where bark cracking and actually some necrosis. There's another possible implication if you add too much pressure with the treatment system, you can literally blow the xylem and the phloem tissue away at that cambial region. And so then you get these necrotic areas where you get these separations, and then you can see actually bark cracking going outward. Now, is this a big deal or not? Don't know. In some cases, actually, what you do get is sealing over, and you don't get oxygen into the area here. On the other hand, some cases, these wounds are staying open 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and it's allowing what? Entry of oxygen potentially into this core of tree, supporting fungal communities that may have infected this wood, and all the other organisms that are just doing their work of what they naturally do anyways, of just to decompose material in the natural environment. So this is all, again, the mystery to us, the heartwood, and how there's an implication of these injections causing this. Again, few trees were like this, and even these most severe cases, these are trees that have been treated 5 to 6 times now. They first started treatments in 2009, and their first set of treatments were of the entire ash population was done by 2010, 2011-ish. And so, yeah, these have been treated for a long time period now, but even after that time period of 5 to 6 injections, see me in 30 years or 10 years, and we'll redo this study. And actually at that time, I'd probably do a subsample of 6 just to see what the implications are, rather than try to cut 60 trees at one time to do a study. Again, just another cross-sectional area showing the implications of merging of a wound into this false heartwood. Again, it's a mystery to us, but really what's probably most important maybe to avoid this is starting with the application of the treatment to prevent a tree from dying from emerald ash borer to begin with. So in the last 40 plus minutes, I talked about, managing ash tree population for emerald ash borer. It's really, I like to say, you can manage or not manage, what's the worst that could happen. And really thinking about all this context, it's more than just treating a tree with pesticides. It's really urban forest management 101, or you'd be doing things anyways, assessing trees for their health, making decisions the tree that makes sense to treat, or maybe it's a healthy tree, you need to do nothing. Maybe it's a tree that needs to be pruned for just clearance of vehicles and sidewalks where people move. Or maybe it's a tree that actually removal makes the most sense because it's at the end of its life cycle. And really it's a context of, I've framed this any of these things, whether it's Dutch elm disease or emerald ash borer or ash decline, putting our models of sustainability in play here. We're looking just not on the environmental impact. So if trees are gone, they're not taking up air pollution. And North America, what do we find? Well, actually crime rates went up, oddly enough, and also death rates of people with pre-existing conditions increased. And there's an economic cost to this. So certainly if the costs were in our case, we could, if we increased the cost by 10-fold when we did our study, that was kind of the tipping point where it no longer is economically favorable. But thinking of economic models and how that fit into our decision making, and plus is people, and frankly, people are an important part of this whole equation. And in some communities in North America, for example, pesticides, for example, in Canada, they have very little options. They have a natural neem type product that does actually work for emerald ash borer treatments, but they don't allow things like imamectin benzoate. I was actually doing some research last night, and it seems like imamectin benzoate is a chemical that's approved in the UK. In some places in the European Union, some states do allow it, and others, or excuse me, some countries allow it and others do not. But regardless, certainly having the availability of a pesticide is one thing, but if it's socially desirable is another thing. So I thank you for your active listening here today. I'm going to turn it back over to Barnaby for any questions and answers that you may have. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Rich. That was well, you've had to go and you've covered a massive spectrum in a short period of time, and sounds like you've got some fascinating research going on right now at the moment. And I wonder, first of all, if there's something just like Richard Buggs was, if there's things that we can be on the lookout for, but perhaps if there's not been observations of false heartwood in ash species, I guess it would be, from my observations, although we get discoloration from the ash dieback fungus in the xylem to a certain extent, and in smaller plants. I can't say I've got much experience of big trees, so I know some of the attendees here are going to be out on sites in forests. So I guess it would be interesting if you do have observations of sort of merging discoloration caused by ash dieback lesions, and see if there's anything that looks the least bit similar, because I imagine that would be at the very least an interesting observation, and possibly something that might feed back into your research. So less of a question, more of me saying something there. But if I move to Bronte, I think there has been some chat, and then we'll move on to anyone who wants to stick their hand up.
Yes, we've got one question from Madeline, who's asked if EOB is more prevalent in areas that have other tree pests and diseases.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And the short answer is our native ash populations, for the most part, and then Fractionus pennsylvanica is one, green ash, Fractionus americana, which is white ash, is another, and probably even more so Fractionus nigra, which is black ash, which occurs in wet areas, are very susceptible. Black ash being the most, and that's actually unfortunately kind of an ecological concern. That's another story, because it's a dominant tree species in some wet areas in the north central part of the United States. But it's a primary killer. It's not a secondary. Now, it's certainly possible ash trees that are under stress would be more susceptible to emerald ash borer, but trees that are very healthy are just as susceptible. Okay, from a visual observation, and there's no data to find that a weakened tree is going to be that much more susceptible. So perhaps a weakened tree is going to die maybe a little bit sooner than a tree that's healthy. But again, within 5 to 7 years of emerald ash borer coming to a location, the majority of trees, the tipping point has occurred. And so kind of the inflection point on average, based on like Dan Herm's data, is about 7 years. And that's regardless of a tree in the forest health. On the other hand, certainly the insect, it's Agrillus is the genus, and that particular genera of insects throughout the world, they're common, and then many are really host specific for, in some cases, a species. In other cases, it's host specific at the general level, and that is the case with emerald ash borer. That's at the genus level that's of impact, but it's very aggressive, and yeah, within 5 to 7 years, it's the tipping point. On the positive side, though, is you have time to plan. For example, 2016 is where this insect was first found in the community I live in. And just yesterday, I was driving by to take some photos for something, and I was just driving by trees, and I could actually tell which trees were ash from driving by and seeing up in the canopies the bird flecking going after the larva. So yeah, just to give you an idea how quick it happens, and it's a forest health issue. But one exception, we do have a native species of Fractionus quadrangulata. It's pretty cool because the stems actually are square shaped. And that blue ash is the common name. And it's not a common species throughout North America, but about 50% of those are surviving. And it's interesting when they've actually looked at the genomics of that tree, it parallels Manchurian ash, which you heard about earlier. If you look at like the phylogenetics of it, they're on the opposite ends. but they have similar chemistries. They're trying to deduce what's happening here, but it could be a chemical reaction where chemistries are being produced naturally, which would happen in many trees to cause mortality of larvae. It could be a palatability of the tissue. It could be just the tissue itself is just hard to consume for the larva. Yeah, they're still figuring out all those angles of the ash in North America, and I imagine similar work is occurring in Europe. I'm just not familiar with it. So kind of a lot of words to your answer there, or question.
Thank you. Does anyone want to stick a hand up now? If in the silence of no hands going up, I'll go.
I see one question. It's about, is there a lot of discoloration from ash dieback? Not sure if it's from secondary infection. Yeah, that's kind of the mystery, getting back to that false heartwood. And there certainly is other things that can cause discoloration. And fortunately, with a lot of the specimens, either just randomly it happened, or these are randomly selected trees that I would suspect that this is the case in ash. There wasn't a lot of internal discoloration that was caused from what we thought were other factors besides the injection wounds. So we do have a total discoloration. We also have determined discoloration from false heartwood and also just those caused by the treatments. Then there really wasn't much other discoloration except false heartwood or caused by treatment. So I think it kind of gets at your angle of the question here.
Okay, Claire's come back. It's more of an I guess a statement rather than a question, but and that's what I think is very interesting, is the social interaction of the impacted trees and the preference for stronger regulation rather than seeing dead trees standing. Do you think that your presentation went on along the lines of doing something is better than doing nothing for levels of mortality? Do you think it's also better for that social aspect as well because of the broken window aspect, that it's, rather than getting rid of all the trees, it'd be better just to try and keep it manicured where you can to the level of management so it doesn't look awful?
Oh, certainly. I think the aesthetics aspect, and what's interesting of the study that was done in Cincinnati, but Michelle Kondo was the lead author, and then Jeff Donovan's respiratory and cardiovascular data. These decisions are more than just should we remove the tree because it's a cost scenario. It's really about all these other suite of benefits that often don't get encapsulated in the decision making. Too often the decision makers look at costs, which is really important, but they don't look at the value aspect. And then certainly the loss of trees and the value of human lives. Okay, so now if you're looking at the cost, there's a cost certainly of mortality of people, of hospital care to society, and certainly just the impacts of crime, increased statistics and the costs to actually maybe control it or incarcerate people. And so those are all cost aspects. If you just don't even think about the benefit side and you put those as a cost equation, those are all important components. And really kind of fascinating about parts of science and things like this. We often think about the biology, but the sociology so often gets forgotten. And I think that's a reminder of whether it's ash decline or emerald ash borer, is really thinking about the social aspects and including that as part of the research questions. We often have our research questions, they're really focused and they have to be, but these transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary ideas that in the more modern context of any study is really, really important, especially for large studies, is I think this is a really important reminder of just the importance of the social aspect.
I think we just got another question from John in the chat as well. What are the rates of spread of EAB independent of human transport?
Oh, I think you hit a really important one here. If it's not by humans, the insect itself, what they say in English units is about 15 miles. And most are within 6. And actually, I should say the vast majority are really close. And so we often say that if they find an infection within 15 miles, it probably will be near you within the next year or 2. And so that's just kind of a context. The insects themselves don't fly far, but there's some observations that they can fly some distances up to a few miles. Okay, but that's 6 to 15, and there's a lot of factors that interplay. Firewood transport was the big mechanism that was suspected to be the transporting aspect. There's certainly data that shows ash wood was moved from one place to another. Okay, However, as being the primary spread, I don't think that is the case. There are a few papers showing automobiles. And interesting enough, I get a chance to drive enough throughout North America, and where you see the rates of spread the most is along highway corridors. And also, like in my community, I think ground center of infestation entry point was actually right near a railroad location. So these things have been actually observed to be hitchhikers. And interesting enough, one of my good friends from a previous state I worked at, the agency, this individual was visiting one of the study sites in Michigan to learn information to bring back home. Interesting enough, the first infestation found in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area was at a tree next door to this individual. So is it just by fluke chance, or did it hitchhike in a suitcase? Now that's a fun story. I give my friend some heck about, hey, thanks buddy for introducing it. It would have got there anyways. But yeah, automobiles is there's some evidence about that. And if you just look visually, that it just follows like these corridors of people movement with vehicles, trains, and semis and the like. Great question. I hope that answered your question.
It did to me. Yes, I was thinking that was, yes, really interesting thinking about what we've known about the introduction in Russia of emerald ash borer out of Moscow, and that appears to be again correlating along their motorways. But of course, they went and planted them up with American ash to make a delicious sort of snack route as well. So, but there's the latest finding was somewhere in St. Petersburg, wasn't it, at the end of one of those motorways? So yes, that's interesting. Would you think that hitchhiking could potentially be more significant than firewood? Because I know from what I've read, that firewood's sort of always highlighted as one of the most significant human routes of this accidental spread in the States. But do you think that actual hitchhiking on one form of transport or another is probably more significant?
Yeah, I do think. I think it's a rate of vehicle movement. People that are professionally moving goods in semis and trains, those things are moving probably more so than the average car, but there's a lot more cars and semis and trains, for example. And certainly got to North America, not by firewood. It got there by transport cargo. And so there's obviously just from that aspect, and there's evidence that there's probably more than just one entry point through cargo from Asia that I got here. And so it wasn't in that case firewood. And if you treat firewood properly, you're supposed to season it for a couple of years. You're no longer going to have the adults there. It's only fresh wood that has larvae and adults that could leave from it. So if you don't know much about firewood, yeah, you'd be one that could move it through fresh green wood, but not wood that's seasoned properly for firewood from that perspective. But more so commercial tree care companies, movement of wood from one location to another. That's probably, and that's not firewood, it's just woody material that's being moved from one spot to another. So.
Okay, there was a question that's about resources for better understanding compartmentalization. I don't know if that's under your very broad umbrella, the forestry knowledge is something you could recommend.
Oh yeah, and I'm just trying to think of actually a book in my arsenal here, and I can't find it. I can't pronounce the last name of the author. Dirk's name from Europe has a really good book on tree compartmentalization. Certainly going back to the classic work from Alex Scheigo that really set this whole work in play. And then Scheigo would certainly give credit to his predecessors. But a modern take, Dirk's book on compartmentalization of trees is a good one. And what's really interesting is just the modern context change. Scheigo called it decay was the D, and now they've changed it to either damage or dysfunction. And that was a hard one for me because I knew Dr. Scheigo in my early career days, and it's like, that's a tough one for me. But no, actually, Scheigo would probably say dysfunction or damage makes more sense. Decay is an end route, but certainly it's the damage that the tree's responding to or the dysfunction. So from a pathological perspective, that makes sense.
Thank you. I'm aware that you've probably got a couple of minutes before you have to disappear off, and I'm really appreciative of you fitting all this in pre-lecturing. I was just thinking as a sort of, unless anyone's got a hand to stick up, have you got any advice for spotting emerald ash dieback as an emerald ash borer at an early level, in thinking about we're going to have a country where we've got trees which are suffering in crown decline from ash dieback? So is there anything we should be particularly vigilant for?
Yeah, certainly looking up in canopies of trees for any evidence of, they call it like speckling, but where you can see a light tan So the larvae are being attacked by birds. So excavator birds, or I should say birds, finding larvae, and the outer bark is falling off, so it's a lighter tan color. The other part is just natural crown thinning, like you see with ash decline. And perhaps you've got models there to how to rate trees for thinning. In the United States, there was a researcher, Smitley, that came up with an ash thinning. And so it's really, you look at this set of pictures and 10 of them, putting them in the category of 100%, where it's 100% thin to 90% thin to 0%, which you've had no thinning.
Yeah,
So
we have
that's
some,
another way to look at it.
okay, we have Forestry Commission sort of pictorial guides with
Yep.
the sort of one. So doing that, but taking into context, I guess, if there's an acceleration compared to what you've seen with ash dieback, maybe as but definitely looking for woodpecker related stuff. And
Yeah,
that's
but here's
the
an
thing.
interesting thing where they've ground zero for emerald ash borer in Michigan, Wisconsin, or Michigan state in the United States. What they first saw in the case there was ash were dying, and they just thought it was ash dieback from other things, because ash do die back. And if you have enough ash, it's common to have some trees die. So they just kind of blew it off for several years until someone goes, no, this is not ash necrosis from whatever pathogen. There's an insect related here that we have no clue what it is. This little shiny emerald metallic insect that has an appearance of an Agrillus species, some sort. And when they sent to our Smithsonian Institute in their collection, they're like, hey, this is Agrillus plantapennis. So as people in the field kind of going, these trees are naturally dying anyways, because green ash do that. And there was some astute person and saw a D-shaped exit hole. So it's really actually working with practitioners in the ground, I think, is an important part, because there's so many arborists around the world, having them as part of your network of people as early observers for things. So that's my last lesson here.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes. So
right.
thank you very much. It's
My
brilliant.
pleasure.
And yes, and in that case, yes, if there's some way you can express your appreciation virtually to Rich, then go ahead and do it. But that's very kind of you to join us, and thanks very much.
Thanks all.
Oh,
My pleasure.
Real clap. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Okay then. In that case, we're going to move on and thanks very much to Richard and Rich. And now, hopefully, somewhere we have got Matt. Are you here? Are you with us, Matt? There's yes, he is. Phew. It's looking like there's such a long list of attendees. Or it's kind of like, have I scanned it? I think I scrolled past you a couple of times out of panic. But so we're finishing off today's meeting with Matt here, and I'm afraid I didn't go and give you a big biography to go and introduce you, because I ran out of time. But you are our tree health pilot officer for the Northwest and West Midlands, and involved really the sharp pointy end of making sure that DEFRA can go and develop something that's actually practical and responsive and useful for our needs in the future. So I guess I'll probably leave it at that, and we can move on.
Thanks, Barnaby. I'll just try and share my screen at the moment. Hopefully this should work. Can we see this?
Yes, I can see you.
Good.
Yes.
There we go. Oh, 1 second. So I'm Matt Smith, as Barnaby pointed out. I'm the Tree Health Woodland Pilot Officer for the Northwest and West Midlands. And in conjunction with DEFRA, we are making a pilot and a grant scheme to help people manage their roadside ash and plantations. Yeah, I think what we're trying to achieve really is a collaborative approach to managing ash dieback in order to mitigate the potential risks of roadside fatalities and roadside injuries to members of the public. Move on to that one. Again, with the ash diebacks, what we're trying to achieve again is the collaborative approach. And I thought I'd just highlight this just to make people aware of what kind of things are available under the grant scheme. One of the caveats I think I should point out is that for any ash application, you will probably end up needing to be into a group. So again, this reaffirms the collaborative approach. And just to highlight again, there are no grants for felling of the ash dieback, but again, there are grants available to help with other costs associated with felling the roadside ash. And again, just to highlight, that is not just aimed at individual landowners. We are offering funding for local authorities. So again, if you are a member of a local authority and you are suffering from ash dieback, please do get in contact with me, and hopefully we can have a discussion to see what kind of options are available for you. And again, this is just a quick snapshot of what is actually available if you do want to sign up for the survey, for the grant. So in relation to quite a lot of other things in there, we've got a 60% road closure cost. We can have surveys for your EPS, restocking, all the things like that, maintenance. It's a £300 a hectare, which I haven't actually put on this. That is actually a maintenance rate for woodland of £300 per hectare for 3 years. As again, we are a pilot that is running for that length of time. Again, what we had, just a quick synopsis of ongoing activities and stuff that we're trying to implement at the same time. So applications originally opened up on the 31st of August 2021. Iteration 2, which after lengthy discussions with stakeholders and local authorities, we are in a position to relaunch this in early February with amendments which we felt didn't actually address the issues during the rollout of iteration 1. So please, if you do want to find out a little bit more than that, you can contact me, and hopefully I'll be able to explain a bit more in detail. And again, with the ongoing activities, we are always looking for feedback. So again, anything you do feel like you want to mention, please send me an email. The next one, and again, this is just to highlight that we're not solely focusing on ash. So if you are a land manager or an owner that has woodland being attacked by any of these pests and diseases, then funding is available. And hopefully, if you do want to come and talk to me about it, you can do. Some of these are the resources there. So I do encourage people, if they're not aware of the Treehouse Pilot, to take a look at the .gov website, which is essentially just a Treehouse Pilot. And that will hopefully give you a lot more information on the whole process, including the EOI process, which is one of the first steps you will need to get done, which is simply just a quick form that you fill out. So an expression of interest with a grid reference number and some contact details. And if you do want to do that, then you can get in contact with me, send it to the main inbox of the Treehouse Pilot scheme. And yeah, I think that was very short and sweet, really. I mean, I would end that on there. I mean, it wasn't as lengthy as I thought it was going to be, but again, I'm happy to leave that at that and answer some questions if people have any.
Yes, thank you very much, Matt. Has anyone got any questions? I don't think there's been, apart from a thank you, there's not been anything else on the chat, but I guess I'd be interested in knowing, because you said this is just a pilot at the moment. So do you think that the end result of whatever this fully formed grant coming at the end of it is going to potentially be able to cope with the sort of aspects that Rich was talking about, where it's repeated management on the same site? So you can you have more than one bite if you're at your cherry, if for the same piece of land for different operations?
I believe so, yes. I mean, this is all a collaborative approach, and we want to make sure that people are have options there to help them fund. So yeah, I mean, we do have a variety of options there for people to help.
Fair enough. Yes, I was just thinking that the combination of if Richard Buggs saying that we still need to be looking out for healthy looking trees, but people still need to be dealing with, as Richard's pointing out, all the dangerous and nasty things that you've got to deal with, and if there's money to, but actually if you take the money, you could potentially come back and do another safety operation and apply for that again and down the road. It's not you played your cards and that's it, and then you're on your own. You suspect that it'll be a sort of something that's,
yeah, it's definitely a rolling thing, because essentially I think one of the main points I did miss out, which I should highlight, is that this pilot will eventually be rolled out into the elms as part of the tree health package for 2024. So it's essentially going to replace the existing current CS tree health grant system. So if the more information we get, and more people that are willing to engage with this, the better the learning, the better the understanding, and then hopefully we will be able to deliver something that is not only fit for purpose, but helpful to roll on later down the years in case we do come across a pest and disease that we're not familiar with.
Okay, so that's not very long from now, actually. 2024, which it did feel a long time ago, not long ago, but now it feels like it's incredibly close. So it's okay. I've got it. So something come in now. Let's have a look on a question. It's something flashed up. I need to press the button though to see if maybe Bronte's. I can't. I'm on people.
You want me? So you've got a question from Mike. So the facilitation rate on the slide was £20 per hour, and it's a bit lower than typical agent consultant rates. Do you think this could be something of a barrier to applicants?
This has come up numerous of times. So again, as this is a rolling pilot, we're always open for the feedback. So this has been mentioned to the people who are policy at the time. So we may be able to increase this in the rollout of iteration 2. So unfortunately, I don't have that number to hand at the moment, but if you do want to get in contact with me, I'll be able to give you an update on whether we increased the facilitation rate to industry standard levels.
Well, thank you. I guess that's something that, yes, if you've got updates you want to go and pass them, well, we'll be happy to go and share that information with the group as just a way of getting that around. Because if you're after more people to give you feedback and try in this final trial year, the more the merrier. I guess a couple of years ago there was a lot more Phytophthora rumorum related stuff, but knowing the regional situation being bad but not as bad as previous years, are you still looking for more larch related sort of inquiries, or is it have you got more than enough to keep you going?
Again, we're always looking for applications. It just generally just comes down to what kind of learning objectives we can get from the sites. So if people do want to send in EOI form in, they're more than welcome to. It's just a question of whether we would like to take that forward and learn from it.
That sounds like a big open door to me. So yes, so please, spread the word, even if you don't know yourself, don't have a scenario yourself. But yes, if you think of someone else who potentially benefit from money from the government to go and do something with these nasties, then please spread the word. Okay, then, have we got anyone who wants to stick hands up or send ask a question? Otherwise, I think, well, you've done well for concentrating for 2¼ hours on some quite broad and some scientific-y deep related stuff as well. So if everyone's happy or comatose, one or the other, I think we'll go and draw the meeting to a close. But what would be nice to do for the next Northwest Tree Health Group meeting is to have something face to face, and I think that would be something. So this summer, I'd like to go and aim towards having some sort of face to face meeting, because it has been a long period of time. It's we've had the pandemic between us, and although it's never going to be ideal for everybody, because we've got more than 300 members on the list, if people have got suggestions or offerings of locations that might go and accommodate quantities of people and hopefully interesting presenters, then please let me know, and then we'll go and work on from that. But I think having some meetings every year online makes a lot of sense, because we've got some people who just are going to have real trouble accessing us otherwise, and the hybrid format means that we are able to invite members and experts that we wouldn't necessarily be able to go and drag kicking and screaming into the Northwest as well. So I think a hybrid model is probably a good one to go with. But yes, it'd be lovely to aim for face-to-face next time. So yes, I think I let you have the rest of the day off. I think that's probably the best thing to do, isn't it? I'll go and stop recording, and thank you very much indeed. How do you go and stop recording? I'll do that. I have stopped recording.